webinar series. I'm your host, Joey Convento. Today's webinar installment is Healthy Eating. Good nutrition is crucial for health, particularly in times when the immune system might need to fight back. Joining us today is Taylor Oplinger. Taylor is a dietetic intern at UCSF. She is from Dallas, Texas. She received her undergraduate degree in kinesiology from Rice University in Houston and subsequently completed her graduate degree in exercise and sports nutrition at Texas Women's University in Denton. Her primary area of interest is inpatient adult dietetics. Now, before we start, we encourage you to use the chat function to submit your questions that will be answered at the end of the presentation, and that icon can be found below the screen. In addition, again, this webinar, along with previous webinars, will be available on our fitness video archive by logging on to fitness.ucsf.edu, and I'll make sure to type that in the chat room. And now, everyone, please welcome Taylor Oplinger.
Hi, thanks, Joey. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. I am so excited to talk to you guys today and give you my presentation on eating for health. This presentation was originally created by myself and a fellow dietetic intern of mine, Rachel, although I will be the only one presenting here today. Throughout today's presentation, I will first discuss tips for long-term success, and then move on to how to see food like a dietitian, and finally conclude with the 3 R's of healthy cooking, which are reduce, replace, and remove. Starting with tips for long-term success, I have about 4 or 5. The first, and I think one of the most important ones, is to set SMART goals. So SMART goals stand for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And these are goals that, it's a framework for creating goals such that we have more specific and measurable outcomes rather than broad strokes goals that can sometimes be not very specific and not necessarily lay out an exact framework for us to achieve those goals. So rather than saying, I would like to lose weight, saying, I would like to lose 30 pounds over the next 6 to 8 months. And how am I going to lose those 30 pounds over the next 6 to 8 months? I would like to increase my walking. I would like to work out a few more days a week, and kind of setting very specific, measurable, achievable, and attainable goals for yourself can put you in the right path towards achieving those goals. And then setting inclusion goals rather than exclusion goals. I also think this is very important. So what this means is, instead of setting goals that make you feel restricted and limited, setting goals that let you achieve things, kind of like ticking boxes off of a checklist. So rather than saying, I am only going to eat chips as my snack 2 days a week, saying 2 days out of the week, I am going to replace my snacks, my chips or my whatever it may be, with fruit or with some sort of like vegetable snack. And that way you can kind of tick it off, and it's more of an achievement-based system rather than a restriction-based system. And in that way, you can limit the tendency that some of us have.
Vai a finire il bagno prima di uscire, ok? Stiamo un po' la camera.
Okay, I think there may be one person who is potentially not on mute. If you could just mute your microphone, please. Thank you. But yeah, setting inclusion goals rather than exclusion goals. And then also starting slow. So not trying to do it all at once. This is definitely a pitfall a lot of us fall into when we're setting nutrition goals and or fitness goals, or just goals for ourselves in general, trying to do it all immediately at once. It's totally okay to take things a step at a time. Also, practice mindful eating. So practicing mindful eating means largely just paying attention to your hunger cues and recognizing emotional or bored eating. We use food to fill a lot of our emotions, whether they're good emotions, celebrate, or even sometimes when we're just bored and we just have a craving. It's important to start to recognize if you're wanting to lose weight, but just in general, to create a healthier relationship with when you are truly hungry, when you are truly full, recognizing that you can eat when.
Taylor, I'm sorry, you're cutting out every so often. I'm wondering if you can come a little closer. Everyone, I'm sorry. We apologize for the technical difficulty. I can see the slides.
Okay. And if for some reason I'm starting to cut out again, just maybe someone can send a chat to the group, or Joey, you can kind of hop on and let me know if for some reason something starts to happen.
I'll certainly monitor that for you.
Okay,
Taylor.
thank you so much. Okay, but along with, okay, so we were talking about mindful eating, and we were talking about paying attention to hunger cues and recognizing bored and emotional eating. In addition, only taking what you need. This is just kind of one strategy for this. Sometimes we tend to grab the whole bag of potato chips instead of just the serving that we want or just the serving that we need in the moment. And sometimes taking smaller amounts and then only going back if you really feel like you need more, you didn't get enough, is just one general approach. Focusing on volume, so focusing on more fruits and vegetables and eating those on your plate first before eating other things. Fruits and vegetables take up a lot of room in our stomachs. They make us feel full. They have a lot of fiber. They can make us feel fuller for longer for that reason. And so sometimes if you feel like you're overeating certain foods that maybe are more caloric dense or really, really sweet or particularly high in fat, then focusing on larger volume foods that don't have as many calories, such as fruits or vegetables, can be a good first step. And then also making your rewards about something other than food. So instead of saying, okay, you know what, I did really well this week, I'm going to have a crazy cheat day on Saturday, making your reward going on a hike that you've been wanting to go on for a little while, or going to watch a movie with your family or your friends, or doing something to reward yourself and still recognize that you've achieved something significant, but not necessarily having to establish a relationship with food where you use quote unquote bad food to reward yourself for eating quote unquote good food. We want to try to limit those relationships. Motivate, knowing who you are, knowing the things that motivate you, knowing the things that may be your downfall, and recognizing those rather than ignoring those things, and finding ways to approach them. One example that I use is that for me, when I've worked a really long day in the hospital and I come home, it's hard for me to find the motivation to work out sometimes. But
Taylor,
and once I have that, yes?
I'm sorry, you're cutting out. Your voice is cutting out. I'm not sure if it's because you're away from the mic, but yeah, it's intermittent.
It's intermittent.
Yeah. Okay, it's fine now.
Okay, I will also maybe speak a little slower. But yeah, so finding intrinsic motivators, knowing yourself, and knowing the things that may be your downfall, and trying to create strategies for overcoming those things. So then moving into seeing food like a dietitian. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about with good relationships with food, seeing food as good or bad. We really want to try to minimize our outlook on food in that way, and rather see food as foods that contain food components that promote health versus food components that contribute to negative health outcomes, rather than just plain good foods or just plain bad foods. And one good way to start this process is to talk about the 5 different food groups that make up in each of these food. There's no need to necessarily limit carbohydrates in your diet, but there are definitely better carbohydrates to choose than others. Grains are a great source of vitamins and minerals when you choose whole grains, and they're also an amazing source of fiber. And so when choosing grains, again, you don't need to limit them. You can just choose whole grains rather than refined grains whenever you are going to eat a carbohydrate or a starch. For proteins, protein is also a good source of vitamins and minerals, even though we don't necessarily think of it being a source of vitamins and minerals. It's also a really good source of fiber when you choose plant proteins, such as beans or lentils or nuts or seeds. And the best options within the protein category are plant proteins, so all of the ones that I just mentioned, and or lean meats, which we usually consider to be any meat that has 0 to 3 grams of fat per ounce. Within vegetables, vegetables are, of course, all amazing and great. They're also a great source of vitamins and minerals. They also are an excellent source of fiber, particularly insoluble fiber, which really vegetables are whole versus juiced, not necessarily because juiced vegetables or vegetable juices are bad in any way, but just it's important to keep in mind that when you juice things, you often lose that fibrous component. Also, on top of that, you often have added sugars in vegetable juices, whereas you wouldn't in a whole vegetable. And then if you do have diabetes and you are watching your carbohydrates, it's not necessarily important that you completely limit starchy vegetables such as potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, and or squashes. But it is important to keep in mind that if you're tracking your carbohydrate intake, starchy vegetables that I just mentioned are an additional source of carbohydrate in your diet. Within fruits, again, great source of vitamins and minerals and fiber. When you choose the whole option versus juiced option, I will also say that frozen fruits are also a perfectly okay alternative to fresh fruits. If anything, they may actually be more nutrient dense because frozen fruits are picked at their peak of ripeness and then they are immediately flash frozen to seal in all the nutrients, whereas sometimes whole fruits can be alternatively picked a little bit before they're completely ripe, just so that they don't tarnish or so that they don't go bad before reaching the grocery store. And finally, dairy. So dairy is a really great source of protein, especially for people who are vegetarian. And the best options in this category are low fat or no. Mostly the thing that we like about dairy is that it contains a good amount of calcium. And so if you are going to choose non-dairy alternatives, choosing alternatives that are fortified with calcium is an important thing to watch out for. So soy milk fortified with calcium, almond milk fortified with calcium, things like of this nature. And then even outside of the main of these main food groups, there are of course but that are either found in these food groups or that are often added during cooking or preparation. So one example or one thing I definitely want to talk about is added fats. So you find fats within foods, so you can find them largely usually within the dairy food groups and the protein food groups, or they can be added during preparation. And there are 3 main types of fat. There is unsaturated fat, saturated fat, and trans fat. Unsaturated fat is found in vegetables and nuts, and this is for example, olive oil, any nuts or seeds, or avocado, for example. Unsaturated fat is incredibly healthy. It helps to reduce the bad cholesterol in our blood and increase the good cholesterol in our blood. And this is the type of fat that you want to focus on a majority of the time. And then for saturated fat, this is considered an unhealthy type of fat. So saturated fat is usually found in your high-fat meats and high-fat dairies. It can also be found in coconut oil and palm oil. And this is a type of fat that increases the bad cholesterol in our blood. So it's recommended to limit the amount of saturated fat that you consume. Trans fat is actually a type of fat that you won't necessarily find in nature. It's something that is made in a lab. And basically, because of that, you usually find it in packaged or pre-prepared foods, cookies, cakes, pies. It's a very, very solid, very creamy fat that's great for cooking, but it not only increases the bad cholesterol in our blood, but decreases the good cholesterol in our blood. So trans fat is something, probably one of the only things in nutrition that we recommend completely avoiding in all cases and not consuming at all. If you look on the back of a food label, even if something says it has no trans fat in it, that's because there has to be at least half to a gram of trans fat in something for it to be listed on the nutrition label. So look in the ingredients, and if it says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, that's a trans fat. For beverages, it's definitely the best to hydrate with water. We recommend at least 8 cups a day, barring any health conditions that require you to limit the amount of fluid that you consume. Water is the best one to consume. And then also keep in mind that beverages oftentimes can be sweetened with sugars. Of course, and actually,
Taylor,
as
I'm sorry to
electrolyte
interrupt.
substitutions or electrolyte drinks.
Taylor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you seem to be cutting out more often now. I'm wondering if it's possible that you call in.
I call in?
Yeah, and use your cellular phone.
To share my screen.
I believe, yeah, you'll
Yes,
still be able to share your screen.
Okay. I'm so sorry, everybody, for these technical difficulties.
Oh.
I've given so many presentations from home, and this has not once yet happened, so I don't know what's going on. Again, I apologize.
We just know about the food, not the rest, so no worries.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, yeah, thank you so much for everybody who's sticking with me. We will keep going from here. I left off at beverages. I'm going to move on to packaged food now. So the important things to watch out for packaged food are, of course, that packaged foods often have added sugar, saturated fat, and trans fat, and particularly a lot of sodium as well, just because it keeps those packaged foods better for longer. So there is a purpose for it. But if you are trying to limit sugar in your diet or saturated or trans fat or sodium, starting by limiting packaged food or processed food is a great way to start. Okay, so now moving into the 3 R's of healthy cooking, or just healthy eating in general. And this is reduce, remove, replace, and remove. And this is kind of just a general progression for moving towards meeting your goals and replacing or removing or reducing whatever it is in your diet that you're trying to change. And so these tools can be used to focus on making your diet more health promoting, such as limiting trans fat and saturated fats, because again, those are the fats that alter our cholesterol and reduce the good cholesterol and increase the bad cholesterol. By reducing added sugar in the diet and sodium, added sugar in high quantities can contribute to, for example, diabetes, and high sodium in the diet can contribute to hypertension. So these are 3 components of our diet that we can change and to just overall improve the healthiness of our diet. And then in addition to those changes, if your goal is specifically weight loss, for example, you can choose food lower in calories by reducing, replacing, or removing foods with higher caloric density, with added fat, because fat is a very concentrated source of calories, and or added sugar, because quite often the added sugar in our diet contributes to many more calories than we recognize. This also can apply to not even necessarily health goals and or weight loss goals, but just kind of general diet approach goals. For example, if you're trying to lead into having more of a plant-based diet, which is a goal of mine that I've been having recently, I started by first reducing the number of meals that I was having a day that contained meat. I am now moving into replacing the meat in my meals with alternatives, and potentially eventually completely removing meat altogether and focusing on a plant-based diet. But we're going to start with fat. So fat is usually found in dairy products, baked goods, high-fat meats, oils, nuts, and seeds. You can reduce fat when you're cooking by taking the amount of fat that any recipe calls for and immediately reducing it by 50%. Even when you're baking, this maintains the quality and consistency of the product that you're baking. And then of course, when you're cooking, ingredients are much more, you can alter ingredients much more easily without sacrificing necessarily the quality of the food that comes out. When you're buying, you can reduce fat in what you're buying by using reduced fat dairies, reduced fat gravies, biscuits. Broths are often actually a hidden source of fat that we don't think about, and then reduced fat dressings. It is important to note that oftentimes when you reduce the fat in a product, specifically a processed product, sometimes added sugar is used to kind of enhance the flavors that are lost by reducing the fat. So watch out for the added sugar in your low fat products. But food science has made leaps and bounds, and you can often find now reduced fat products that don't necessarily have a lot of added sugar. You can also replace the fat in your diet by using fat-free cooking spray instead of oil. You can bake, steam, or grill instead of fry. And when you're buying food, one example could be swapping high-fat meat for lean meats, which we already talked about. So avoiding the bacon, some of the red meats, the steaks, pork, things like that, and focusing more on chicken, turkey, fish is also a great example. And then just in general, fat is one place I talked about, you can improve just the overall quality of your diet by choosing oils, butters, or condiments that are made with healthy fat ingredients. So you can find mayonnaise that's made with olive oil nowadays. You can find butters that are made with olive oil, and all of these products that previously maybe would have been considered more unhealthy now have healthy alternatives. And then finally, to completely just remove or increase the amount of fat that you remove from your diet, you can remove oil, butter used in greasing your pans. And then also one great way to remove fat, and particularly the saturated fat or the unhealthy fat from meats that you may cook, is to remove the skin from the meat after you're cooking, or to trim off any excess fat, in addition to just buying leaner cuts of meat to begin with. Added sugar is another area of the diet that may want to focus on, usually found in baked goods, dressings, sauces, and beverages. You can reduce it, again, even when baking, by reducing the total amount of sugar in your recipe by 1/3. When you're buying food, buying no added sugar substitutes for dairy, add no added sugar substitutes for peanut butter, canned fruit, or fruit juice. So even these products that generally have added sugar, such as peanut butter or canned fruit or fruit juice, you can usually find no sugar added alternatives that focus more on the whole food rather than sweetening it, overly sweetening it. You can also replace when you're cooking, or when you're flavoring your coffee or flavoring anything with sugar substitutes. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not sugar substitutes are healthy, and all of the research that we have shows that artificial sweeteners are in fact perfectly okay to use, are not necessarily dangerous. It would take very, very, very high quantities of these ingredients and of these products for them to start causing negative health consequences. So for all intents and purposes, sugar substitutes are definitely a reasonable alternative to added sugar. And then finally, removing added sugar altogether by choosing alternatives to cookies, cakes, pies, candies, and soda, which are definitely the biggest contributors to the added sugar that we have in our diet. Moving on to sodium. So added sodium is often found mostly in cured meats, baked goods, gravies, sauces, and condiments. You can reduce it automatically by using half as much as salt as a recipe calls for. And then when you're buying ingredients to cook with, you can choose low sodium versions. Almost everything nowadays has a low sodium version that you can find in the store. And you can choose canned ingredients with no added salt. You can replace the sodium or the salt in your cooking with herbs and spices, or you could use alternatives such as Mrs. Dash, which is something that I use. There are so many alternatives nowadays for salt-free cooking and sodium-free cooking that any grocery store, when you're walking down the aisle, when you go to the salt aisle or just the general herbs and spices aisle, you should be able to find some sort of blended low sodium or no sodium alternative. that usually still really enhances the flavor and adds a lot of really good flavor to the meals that you're cooking. And then when you're buying, you can buy pre-cooked or packaged meals that are low in sodium, or you can prepare your own home-cooked meals and then pre-cook them or package them and prepare them with less sodium. And then finally, this is what I do, just not use any salt when you're cooking, and only let salt be added at the table for people who want it, and or, like I said, use alternatives and just avoid it altogether. And while those are all of the major suggestions that I have for kind of approaching your diet to improve the health and the quality of it, there are often two major barriers for everybody for implementing these changes. And the two most common barriers that we hear about are scheduling and budgeting. So here are just a few very quick recommendations for kind of overcoming some of those very common barriers. If time is something that you have an issue with, we're all very busy. You can meal prep foods that hold well. You can purchase prepackaged or pre-portioned foods that are healthier alternatives, low sodium versions, lower fat versions. There's a lot of plant-based versions now. You can purchase frozen foods that are easy to prepare. As I mentioned, frozen foods are actually maybe potentially more nutritious sometimes than fresh foods. Also buying quick cooking options or food delivery options, of which there are many now. If budgeting is an issue, then working on purchasing frozen fruits and veggies or canned versions. Again, frozen fruits and veggies, you can often buy them in bulk. They're usually cheaper. They're still just as nutritious. Canned fruits and vegetables also are a perfectly reasonable option. And especially if you are concerned about the added sugar or the added sodium that you may find in them, you can often drain off the liquid and then just rinse off whatever's in the can and eat that. Or you can buy low sodium or no sugar added versions. Buying on sale and in bulk is also a recommendation. And then additionally, incorporating regularly cheap foods into your diet, such as eggs, peanut butter, lentils, pasta, rice, and in-season fruits and vegetables. In-season fruits and vegetables are usually cheaper just because they are in season. And then that actually also works to increase your nutrient diversity and your overall diet diversity when you can incorporate different fruits and vegetables throughout the year. If anybody has, I'll of course answer questions, but if anybody has leftover questions or you're just generally curious about additional resources for enhancing or improving your diet, then eatright.org is a great place to go. There are many, many articles there. That is the website for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is the nutritional governing agency in the United States. And they have lots of recommendations, all of which should be free. And then, of course, there's Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Their website is accessible to everybody. And of course, the American Heart Association as well has good recommendations. But with that, that is the conclusion of my presentation. Again, thank you so much for everyone who stuck on despite all the technical difficulties. And I can now start answering questions.